My husband didn't slam the door when he left. That's the part people don't believe when I tell them. No shouting, no shaking hands, no tears dripping onto the floor. Just the soft click of the lock, like he was closing a drawer he no longer needed. He stood in the hallway that morning with his jacket already on, keys resting in his palm. The light from the window caught the silver of his watch, the one he'd bought after the divorce papers were drafted, but before they were signed. I noticed things like that back then. Still do. Welcome to my channel, my dear. I'm Mama Jo. And before I tell you what happened next, take a moment and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Every time I read your cities, it reminds me I'm not telling these stories alone. And if you're still here with me, please like this video and subscribe. It's a small thing for you, but it helps this channel survive, and it lets me keep sharing these chapters with you. Now come closer. Let me tell you what happened next. You'll call, he said, calmly, almost kindly. You always do. The words weren't cruel. That was what made them worse. I stood barefoot on the cool tile, my robe pulled tightly around me, and watched him with a face so still I barely recognized it as my own. Somewhere in the kitchen, the kettle screamed itself dry. I had forgotten it on the stove. I'll give you time, he continued, slipping the keys into his pocket. This is a shock, but when reality sets in, you'll understand. Understand. That was his favorite word near the end. He used it like a verdict. You'll realize you need me, he said, opening the door. And when you do, don't make it dramatic. Then he smiled. Not warmly, not sadly, confidently. And with that, he stepped out of my life, certain he was leaving behind a woman who would soon be on her knees. I didn't follow him. I didn't call his name. I didn't even move. I stood there long after his footsteps faded, listening to the kettle scream until the sound cracked into something thin and broken. When I finally turned it off, the water had boiled away, leaving a scorched ring at the bottom of the pot. Funny how quickly things burn when you stop watching them. The house felt too quiet after that. Not peaceful. Hollow, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for me to collapse. I didn't. I walked slowly into the living room, sat down on the sofa, and folded my hands in my lap. The leather creaked under my weight. Sunlight poured through the window in long, unforgiving strips, highlighting every dust particle in the air. This was the moment he was counting on. The moment I would panic. The moment I would call my sister. The moment I would pick up my phone and dial his number with shaking fingers. I didn't reach for the phone. Instead, I breathed. Deep, measured, deliberate. My heart was pounding. Yes. My chest felt tight, yes. But beneath the shock, beneath the ache, something else was stirring. Clarity. I thought back to the night he told me he wanted the divorce, how he sat across from me at the dining table, posture straight, voice even, as if we were discussing a business decision instead of dismantling a life. I've outgrown this, he said then, gesturing vaguely at the room, at me. I need something different. Different was his word for better, and better, in his mind, had nothing to do with loyalty. He believed I would beg because I always had been the steady one, the fixer, the woman who smoothed rough edges and made excuses for other people's shortcomings. He believed my strength came from him. That was his mistake. The first day after he left, I didn't leave the house. Not because I couldn't, but because I didn't want to rush into noise. I needed silence to hear myself think. I made coffee and drank it slowly by the window. I watched a neighbor walk her dog. I noticed the way the sunlight shifted across the floor as the morning passed into afternoon. Every hour that ticked by without me calling him felt like a quiet rebellion. By the second day, the messages started. Not from him, from people. Are you okay? He didn't mean to hurt you. He's under a lot of pressure. Pressure. That word again. I replied politely, briefly. I told them I was fine. I thanked them for their concern. I did not explain myself. By the third day, his sister called. He's worried, she said, her voice low, cautious. He thought you'd reach out by now. I closed my eyes. So did I replied softly. There was a pause on the line. Well, you know him, she said. He's not good with silence. I almost laughed. Silence was the one thing I had mastered. After we hung up, I sat at the dining table, the same one where he had ended our marriage, and ran my fingers along the wood grain. Years of meals, arguments, laughter, all absorbed into that surface. I didn't cry, not yet, because somewhere deep inside me a realization was taking shape. He'd underestimated what it meant that I wasn't reacting. He thought silence meant weakness. He thought restraint meant fear. What he didn't know, what he couldn't imagine, was that while he was waiting for me to beg, I was already doing something else entirely. That afternoon, I pulled out a folder from the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. Not because I planned it that day, but because I had always been the one who kept records. Documents, dates, details. He used to tease me for it. "You worry too much," he'd say, waving his hand dismissively. I opened the folder and spread its contents across the table. Deeds, statements, agreements he had skimmed but never read carefully. Papers he had assumed were handled, forgotten, irrelevant. I studied them slowly, carefully. The clock ticked loudly on the wall, each second marking the distance between the woman he thought I was and the woman I was becoming. That night, when the house finally grew dark and quiet again, I lay in bed alone, staring at the ceiling. The sheets were cold on his side. The pillow still held the faint scent of his cologne. For the first time, tears came. Not loud ones, not messy ones. Just a few that slid silently into my hairline and disappeared. I let them come. Then I let them go. Because grief doesn't cancel resolve, and heartbreak doesn't erase intelligence. Somewhere across the city, he was likely checking his phone, waiting for my name to light up the screen, imagining the moment I would admit defeat. I turned my phone face down on the nightstand. He waited for me to beg. I had already begun to move, before he ever believed he was powerful. He was unsure. That part of him rarely shows up in the stories people tell now, but I remember it clearly. I remember the man who sat at the edge of our bed with his head in his hands, asking the same question over and over again. What if I fail? He wasn't asking for advice. He was asking for permission to keep going. We didn't start with much. Our first apartment was narrow and dim, with a kitchen so small you had to close the door just to open the oven. The walls were thin enough that we learned our neighbors' routines without trying. At night, traffic noise seeped in through the windows like restless thoughts. But it was ours. I made that place feel like something solid. I cooked meals from scratch because it was cheaper. I patched holes in the budget the way I patch socks, quietly, without announcing the effort. When bills arrived, I paid them on time. When money ran thin, I stretched it thinner. He noticed, but not the way you'd hope. At first, he was grateful. He used to kiss my forehead and say, "I don't know how you do it." He leaned on me emotionally, heavily, like a man who had never learned how to carry himself without help. His family was demanding. They spoke in expectations, not encouragement. Success was assumed. Failure was not discussed, only judged. Every visit left him tense. "They expect too much," he said once, after a particularly sharp dinner with them. "I'm never enough." I sat beside him on the couch, rubbing slow circles into his back. "You don't have to be perfect," I said. "You just have to be steady." He nodded, breathing easier. That was my role then, steady. When his ideas didn't work out, I reminded him that mistakes weren't proof of inadequacy. When opportunities slipped away, I helped him frame them as redirections, not rejections. I absorbed his doubts so he could present confidence to the world. I became the place where his fear landed. And I carried it well. Years passed like that. He chased ambition. I held the ground beneath him. I learned how to read his moods before he spoke. I knew when to give space and when to insist he talk. I knew how to smooth tension before it hardened into resentment, or so I thought. Somewhere along the way, support became expectation. Appreciation faded into assumption. My steadiness stopped looking like strength to him and started looking like limitation. He began to want more noise, more admiration, more proof. The dinners got fancier. The people we spent time with changed. He spoke differently, louder, faster, sharper. Words like image and perception crept into conversations that once centered on values. He started correcting me in public. Small things at first. "That's not what I meant," he'd say, laughing lightly. "Let me explain it better," he'd add, waving me off. I noticed. I always noticed. When I asked him once, gently, why he did that, he sighed like I'd asked something unreasonable. "You're sensitive," he said. "People don't mean anything by it." But I did. At family gatherings, his mother would smile tightly and say things like, "You keep him grounded," in a tone that felt less like praise and more like warning, as if grounding was something that could become a problem. He didn't defend me. He just smiled. The man who once leaned into me for reassurance slowly began leaning away from me for validation elsewhere. He liked rooms where people didn't know our history, where no one had seen him doubt himself, where I wasn't the witness to his beginnings. I stayed the same. I didn't reinvent myself. I didn't chase applause. I believed consistency mattered. That belief cost me. By the time success brushed close enough to taste, he had already decided I was part of the before. A chapter that explained him, but no longer fit the story he wanted to tell. When he finally said the words, when he told me he'd outgrown the life we built, I realized something devastating and clarifying all at once. I had never been holding him back. I had been holding him up, and once he learned to stand without wobbling, he decided he didn't need the support anymore. That was the quiet cruelty of it. Not that he left, but that he convinced himself I was the reason he stayed small. As I sat alone in the house after he walked out, replaying years in my mind, I saw the pattern clearly for the first time. He didn't resent my weakness. He resented my strength, because my steadiness reminded him of who he'd been before the confidence, before the ego, before the belief that success entitled him to discard the people who helped him survive the climb. By the time he believed he was powerful, he had already forgotten who made him stable. He thought the divorce was the end of the story. To him, it was a clean cut, a decisive moment. One signature, a few confident words, and the past was handled. He moved forward like a man convinced nothing could follow him once he closed the door. What he didn't understand was this. I didn't start thinking when he left. I started thinking long before, even during the final months of our marriage, when his tone sharpened and his patience thinned. I had noticed the way he rushed through conversations that required care, how he skimmed documents, how he waved away details with the same confidence he used to wave away my concerns. "You worry too much," he said whenever I slowed him down. "You've always been like that." He was right about one thing. I had always been like that, careful, observant, unwilling to assume things would simply work out. While he dreamed in broad strokes, I lived in margins and fine print. While he focused on outcomes, I paid attention to processes. It was how I had kept our household afloat for years without applause, and it was how I protected myself when everything began to crack. During the divorce discussions, he was impatient. He wanted things resolved quickly, cleanly. He spoke about moving on, as if it were a destination he'd already reached. I listened. I didn't argue over furniture or memories. I didn't fight for sentimental victories. I asked practical questions and let him believe they were small. "Let's be reasonable," he said often, tapping his pen against the table. "I don't want this to drag." Neither did I, but not for the same reasons. While he was focused on ending the marriage, I was focused on what came after it, on what would remain once emotion was stripped away and reality stepped in. I began gathering information quietly. Not out of suspicion, but habit. I reviewed timelines, ownership records, accounts that had always been his responsibility, but that I had helped maintain in the background. I noticed inconsistencies he overlooked because he assumed they favored him. I made calls he didn't know about, asked questions he never thought to ask, listened more than I spoke. There was no dramatic moment where a light bulb went off, no sudden revelation that changed everything overnight. It was slower than that. Piece by piece, I understood where I stood and where he was exposed. He underestimated me because I didn't threaten him. I didn't posture. I didn't announce my intentions. I continued showing up to meetings calm and agreeable, letting him believe he was in control. That illusion made him careless. When the paperwork was finalized, he walked away satisfied, confident, certain he had closed every door behind him. I waited, not passively, strategically. In the weeks that followed, I met with people who spoke plainly and listened closely. I asked what protections existed, what timing mattered, what silence could buy me if used correctly. I learned something important during that time. Power doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like patience. I didn't rush to secure my footing publicly. I didn't announce any changes. I didn't give him anything to react to. He kept waiting for the call, the apology, the breakdown, the moment where I admitted I couldn't do this without him. Instead, I disappeared from his emotional radar. That unsettled him more than anger ever would have. I heard about it later, how he mentioned my name casually, expecting concern only to be met with shrugs, how he checked his phone more often than he'd admit, how silence stretched longer than he anticipated. He mistook my restraint for confusion. It was resolve. Over time, I secured what mattered, not loudly, not dramatically. Legally, carefully, with foresight, I positioned myself in a way that protected my future regardless of what he did next. I made sure nothing could be taken from me simply because he assumed it already belonged to him. And then I stopped pushing, stopped preparing, stopped watching him from afar, because once the move was made, there was nothing left to anticipate. He went on with his life, believing he had won, believing the story ended exactly where he wanted it to. He never once considered that the woman he expected to beg had been quietly ensuring she never would. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm, the kind of calm that comes when you know you're no longer vulnerable to someone else's opinion of you. I had spent years holding him together while he figured out who he wanted to be. Now I was holding myself, and that made all the difference. He thought he controlled the ending. I controlled the timing. After the papers were signed and the silence settled, my life did something unexpected. It softened, not in the way people assume. There was no sudden ease, no effortless joy, but in a quieter, truer sense. The sharp edges dulled, the constant vigilance eased. I woke up without bracing myself for someone else's moods. For the first time in years, my days belonged to me. I began small. Morning walks before the city fully stirred, a routine that asked nothing of me but presence. I learned the sound of my own footsteps again, the rhythm of my breath when no one was waiting for answers. I cooked differently too. Simpler meals, slower evenings. I noticed how the light fell across the kitchen counter at dusk, how the house breathed when it wasn't holding tension in its walls. Loneliness visited, yes. It sat with me some nights, patient and quiet. But it didn't own me. I let it pass like weather. What surprised me most was how much strength returned once I stopped explaining myself. I took on work that made sense for my hands and my mind. Nothing glamorous, honest. I learned new systems, updated old skills. I asked questions without apologizing for them. When I didn't know something, I admitted it, and then learned it. Confidence, I discovered, grows fastest when it isn't rushed. Friends returned slowly. New ones arrived without history attached. People who didn't know who I had been married to. People who met me as I was, steady, capable, unadorned. I didn't talk about my past unless asked. When I did, I told the truth plainly. No drama, no bitterness, just facts arranged carefully so they didn't wound me on the way out. Years passed like that, and then, on an afternoon that looked like any other, I met him. It wasn't a grand entrance, no music swelling in the background, just a small community event held in a bright room that smelled faintly of coffee and paper. I had come for the lecture, sat near the back, took notes like I always did. He sat 2 rows ahead of me, listening more than speaking. I noticed the way he paid attention, not to impress, not to perform, but to understand. When people asked questions, he didn't rush to answer. He waited, considered, then spoke with clarity that felt earned, not rehearsed. Afterward, we stood near the door as the room emptied. "That was thoughtful," he said, nodding toward my notebook. "You listen like someone who values time." I smiled. I've learned to. We talked then, not about careers or achievements, but about patterns, about how people move through loss, about rebuilding things that break quietly. He didn't ask me to summarize my life. He didn't probe for wounds. He let the conversation unfold at its own pace, the way I preferred. When he asked if I'd like to get coffee sometime, it didn't feel like an invitation. It felt like an offering. He was calm in a way that didn't demand reassurance, grounded without being rigid. He didn't fill silence with noise. He let it sit, respectful, like a shared understanding. Over time, I learned he was a strategic thinker, not in the flashy sense, but in the way he assessed risk carefully and moved deliberately. He spoke about decisions as ecosystems, not gambles, about sustainability, not spectacle. He valued my thoughts, not because they impressed him, but because they were mine. When I disagreed with him, he listened. When I changed my mind, he didn't hold it against me. He never measured my worth by how convenient I made his life. That alone felt revolutionary. I told him about my marriage slowly, in pieces, as trust allowed. He never flinched, never compared, never tried to rescue me from my past. "That must have taken patience," he said once, after I finished a story I rarely told. "It did," I replied. "And strength," he added gently. I felt seen. Our relationship grew without urgency. No ticking clocks, no performance. We built something quiet and sturdy, like a bridge designed to last rather than impress. When he asked me to marry him, it was on an evening when the house smelled like soup and rain tapped softly against the windows. "I don't want to build a life around expectations," he said. "I want to build one around truth, with you." I said yes. Our wedding was simple, private, joyful in a way that didn't need witnesses. We laughed easily, ate well, slept peacefully. I didn't announce it to the world. I didn't need to. Life settled into a rhythm that felt earned. Mornings began with quiet conversations. Evenings ended with shared reflections. We respected each other's autonomy without creating distance. I never asked him about the full extent of his work, not because it was hidden, but because he never centered his identity around it. When he spoke about investments or analysis, it was with humility, as if the work was a tool, not a throne. One evening, he mentioned a company he'd been looking into. "Struggling," he said thoughtfully. "Good bones, poor discipline." I nodded. "That happens." "Yes," he replied. "Often to people who mistake confidence for competence." I smiled, not realizing how close that truth sat to my own history. I didn't know then that my past was already moving toward my future, that decisions made in silence were aligning, that paths I thought long separated were inching closer with each passing day. All I knew was this: I was no longer waiting for anything to happen to me. I was living, and somewhere, far away from my peace, a man who once believed I needed him had no idea he was no longer invited into my life. The invitation came wrapped in calm. No urgency, no announcement, just a simple suggestion spoken over dinner, the steam from the soup curling between us like a secret. "I need to visit a company I've been working with," my husband said, setting his spoon down carefully. "Would you like to come?" I looked up at him, surprised. He rarely mixed his work with our life unless there was a reason. "Of course," I said. "Where is it?" He smiled just a little. "Downtown." That was all. I didn't ask for the name. I didn't need to. Trust had replaced curiosity between us. If he wanted me to know more, he would tell me. If not, I was content to simply walk beside him. The morning of the visit, the city woke up bright and sharp. Sunlight bounced off glass buildings, turning streets into mirrors. I dressed simply, but deliberately. Nothing loud, nothing uncertain. A deep wine-colored dress, well-cut, comfortable, shoes I could walk in without thinking. As we drove, I watched the city pass by. Familiar streets blurred into unfamiliar corners. Somewhere in my chest, a faint tightening began, not fear, recognition. The building rose into view slowly, glass, steel, wide windows reflecting the sky. My breath caught, not sharply, just enough to notice. I knew this place. I had stood outside it years ago, waiting in the car while my former husband strode in with confidence he borrowed from other people's expectations. I remembered how he used to talk about it, about what it represented: success, status, arrival. Now, seeing it again, it felt like a story I'd finished reading long ago. My husband parked and stepped out first, walking around to open my door as he always did. His hand was warm when he offered it, steady. "You all right?" he asked softly. "Yes," I replied, surprised to find it was true. We walked toward the entrance together. The doors slid open with a quiet hiss, releasing the familiar scent of leather and polished floors. Inside, luxury sat carefully arranged, cars gleaming under lights meant to flatter them, not reveal flaws. Employees moved with practiced smiles, conversations paused, then resumed in lower tones. Something felt tense. Not dramatic, controlled. I felt eyes on us before I saw anyone. At first it was just awareness, a shift in the air. The way people subtly reposition themselves. Then I heard my name, not spoken, recognized. I turned my head slowly. Across the showroom, near a display of imported sedans, stood a man I hadn't seen in years. My former husband. Time had been unkind in small, precise ways. His hair was thinner. His shoulders carried a tightness that hadn't been there before. He was still dressed well, expensive suit, polished shoes, but the confidence sat on him like something borrowed and overdue. He was mid-sentence, gesturing toward a document in his hand when his eyes met mine. He froze. I watched it happen. The exact moment recognition landed. His mouth parted slightly. His brows drew together. He blinked once, Then again, as if the image before him refused to settle into reality. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I stood where I was, my posture relaxed, my hand resting lightly in my husband's. The silence stretched, then his gaze shifted, from my face, to my dress, to my hand, and finally, to the man beside me. I felt my husband straighten subtly, not defensively but fully, as if he had stepped into a space he already owned. His presence was quiet, unassuming, and unmistakable. My former husband took a step forward, then stopped. His shoes squeaked faintly against the marble floor, a sound far too loud in the hush that followed. "What are you doing here?" he asked, forcing a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. The question wasn't really for me. It was for the universe. My husband answered before I could. "We're here for a walkthrough." The word landed differently than visit, more deliberate, more permanent. My former husband frowned. "This isn't a public space," he said quickly. "You'll need permission." "We have it," my husband replied calmly. That was when the manager approached. I recognized him too. Older now, lines carved deep around his mouth. He looked at my husband with something like relief, real, unguarded relief. "Good morning," the manager said, nodding respectfully. "We weren't expecting you today." My former husband's head snapped toward him. "What do you mean you?" The manager hesitated, eyes flicking briefly to me, then back to my husband. "I'll gather the team," he said. Something in my former husband's face shifted. "No," he said sharply, "wait." But the manager was already moving away. My former husband turned back to us, his composure cracking at the edges. "There's been some misunderstanding," he said. "This company, this showroom, it's under my direction." My husband tilted his head slightly, studying him with interest rather than challenge. "For now," he said. The words fell gently, deadly. I felt it then, a low hum beneath the surface, like the ground preparing to shift. Executives approached, tablets in hand, expressions neutral but alert. They formed a loose semicircle around us, careful, deliberate. "As per the finalized agreement," one of them began, voice formal, "we'd like to welcome our majority stakeholder." The air went thin. My former husband's face drained of color so quickly it startled me. His grip tightened around the folder he was holding, knuckles whitening. "Majority?" he whispered. The executive nodded. 80% ownership. I didn't look at him. I watched my former husband. I watched the realization unfold in slow motion, the recalculations, the memories snapping into place, the sudden clarity of all the warnings he'd ignored. He looked at my husband, then at the executives, then at me. "You knew," he said hoarsely. I shook my head once. "No." That seemed to unbalance him more than accusation would have. "You didn't plan this?" he pressed. "I planned my life," I replied evenly. "Not yours." The words didn't shake, neither did I. My husband spoke again, calm as ever. "We'll review operations later. For now, we just wanted to see things firsthand." The executives nodded, already adjusting their stance, their loyalty shifting without ceremony. As they dispersed, my former husband stood rooted to the spot, staring at the floor as if it might open and swallow him whole. I felt no triumph, only certainty. The past had finally caught up with the present, and neither of us could pretend otherwise. I realized then that collisions don't always make noise. Sometimes they just stop you. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was crowded. Crowded with realization, with regret, with the sound of plans collapsing quietly inside a man who had never imagined this ending. My former husband didn't move at first. He stood there in the middle of the showroom like someone whose body had forgotten its instructions. The folder in his hand trembled slightly, betraying the calm he tried so hard to reclaim. Around us, life cautiously resumed. A salesperson cleared their throat. Somewhere, a phone vibrated and was quickly silenced. Shoes clicked softly against marble as people pretended to return to work, though no one truly did. Everyone felt it, the shift. He lifted his head slowly as if gravity had suddenly increased. "You," he started, then stopped. His voice failed him. He swallowed hard and tried again. "You can't just walk in here and take over." My husband didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. He stood with the ease of someone who understood timing, who knew that silence, when used correctly, could do more damage than argument. "I didn't take over," he said at last gently. "I invested." The word echoed, invested. My former husband laughed once, a sharp, brittle sound that cracked before it finished forming. "This is my family's business," he said. "You don't understand what you're doing." My husband met his gaze calmly. "I understand exactly what I'm doing." That was when my former husband looked at me again. Really looked. Not the woman he divorced, not the woman he expected to beg, the woman standing there now. My posture was relaxed. My shoulders were loose. My face held no anger, no satisfaction, no hunger for apology. I wasn't bracing myself for impact. I was already past it. "You knew I was struggling," he said to me, his voice dropping. "You could have warned me." I tilted my head slightly. "You stopped listening to me years ago." The words were soft, but they landed heavily. He flinched. "I would have helped you," he insisted. "If you'd come to me—" "You mean if I'd asked," I said calmly. He nodded eagerly, grasping at the idea. "Yes." I shook my head. "That was never how it worked between us." His brows drew together, confusion battling disbelief. I continued, my voice steady. "I held you together when you doubted yourself. I absorbed your fear so you could stand tall in front of others. And when you decided I was no longer useful, you assumed I lost my footing." I paused just long enough. I didn't. The executives nearby stood perfectly still now, eyes carefully trained elsewhere but ears clearly engaged. Power doesn't need an audience, but it always attracts one. My former husband's gaze darted between us. "This is revenge," he said weakly. "You planned this." I almost smiled. "No," I replied. "This is consequence." The distinction mattered. He turned back to my husband, desperation creeping into his posture. "You don't understand what she's like," he said quickly. She's patient. She waits." My husband nodded once. "I've noticed." That was when it happened. The final collapse. The realization arrived fully formed, merciless in its clarity. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't something he could negotiate his way out of. The woman he dismissed had rebuilt herself. The woman he underestimated had aligned herself wisely. The life he thought he controlled had moved on without him. I watched his face as it registered the truth. I realized then, money didn't elevate him. It exposed him. Exposed the shortcuts he took, the warnings he ignored, the arrogance he mistook for confidence. His shoulders slumped slightly as if the invisible weight he'd been carrying finally pressed down all at once. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. The question wasn't directed at me, but I answered anyway. "Now," I said, "you live with the choices you made." My husband placed a hand lightly at the small of my back, not to guide me, not to shield me, just presence, just partnership. "We'll be reviewing leadership structure," he said evenly. "Decisions will be made carefully." My former husband nodded numbly. Of course. For the first time, he sounded unsure. I felt something inside me settle completely. Not satisfaction, not triumph, completion. I had spent years carrying him, years explaining him, years making space for his insecurities. And here he was, standing in the world he'd chased so desperately, realizing he had lost everything that truly mattered. He looked at me one last time. "You really never needed me," he said. I met his eyes, calm and clear. "No," I replied. "I chose you. There's a difference." He had no response to that. As we turned to leave, the showroom lights seemed brighter than before, reflecting off glass and metal without intimidation. My heels clicked softly against the floor, steady and unhurried. Behind me, I felt him still standing there, frozen. Not by cruelty, not by revenge, but by the understanding that the power he chased had never been his to begin with. The aftermath didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived with quiet adjustments. In the weeks that followed, the company began to breathe differently. Meetings shortened, decisions slowed down. Numbers were read twice instead of once. Where panic had once lived, process took its place. My husband didn't parade authority. He didn't humiliate anyone. He asked careful questions and listened to the answers. Systems were put back where ego had once stood. Waste was trimmed. Discipline returned. The showroom looked the same to outsiders, still gleaming, still impressive. But inside, the tension had eased. People stood straighter. They slept better. They worked with a sense of direction instead of fear. And my former husband? He remained. Not out of loyalty, out of necessity. His role shrank quietly, like a shadow retreating at dusk. He attended meetings instead of leading them. He asked permission instead of issuing commands. His opinions were considered, sometimes accepted, sometimes set aside. No one announced the change. Everyone felt it. I heard about these things secondhand and then less and less. The updates grew less interesting as my life grew fuller. What once might have satisfied my curiosity now barely stirred it, because my days had found their rhythm again. I woke up to sunlight and calm conversation. I drank coffee slowly, listening to the city wake up beyond the windows. I worked at things that mattered to me. I laughed more easily. I slept without bracing for impact. Peace, I learned, is not loud. It doesn't need witnesses. We returned to the showroom once more, weeks later, for reasons that had nothing to do with the past. A brief walkthrough, a conversation about expansion, an assessment of progress. I moved through the space without memory tugging at my sleeves. It no longer belonged to my story. As we walked toward the exit, I felt my husband's hand find mine, warm and steady. There was no tension in my grip, no need to reassure myself that this was real. It was. Outside, the evening air was cool and gentle. The city glowed with its usual urgency, unaware of the small revolutions that happen quietly inside people. We paused at the edge of the sidewalk, waiting for the light to change. "You okay?" he asked. I smiled. More than okay. And I was. I thought about the woman I had been, the one standing barefoot on cold tile, listening to a man tell her she would call. She would beg. She would return to him once reality set in. I thought about how close I had come, in that moment, to believing him. But reality had set in, just not the way he expected. Reality taught me that dignity doesn't need an audience, that patience is not weakness, that silence, when chosen, can be the strongest answer of all. I never went back to explain myself. I never called to correct his assumptions. I never defended my choices. I didn't need to, because closure is not something someone gives you. It's something you claim. As we crossed the street together, hand in hand, I felt light, not because I had won, but because I had finished. Finished carrying what wasn't mine. Finished proving what never needed proof. Finished living as a reaction to someone else's expectations. I had walked through loss, through loneliness, through quiet rebuilding, and on the other side I had found something far more valuable than revenge. I had found myself. If there is one thing I would leave you with, it is this. When someone waits for you to beg, it is because they are afraid of what happens if you don't. So don't. Stand still. Think clearly. Move when you're ready. And when the moment comes to walk away, do it whole. Now listen. My ex-husband once looked me straight in the eye and said I would never reach 1,000 subscribers. He said people wouldn't care enough to listen to an old woman's stories. So if you're still here with me right now, please, help me prove him wrong. Just one click can turn his doubt into my victory. And before you go, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Tell me your city and the time it is where you are. It warms my heart to see how far my stories travel across the world. I share new life stories with you every single day. And in just a moment, 2 of my most loved stories will appear on your screen. Go ahead and choose one to keep me company a little longer, sweetheart.